Nobody noticed what was happening beneath that barn in Montana territory. Not in the autumn of 1886, not from the dirt road that cut through the valley, where wagon wheels had worn two pale grooves into the earth. From out there, it looked like every other homestead structure scattered across the plains. Weathered timber walls faded gray by sun and wind. A peaked roof, patched with tarp paper along the north edge. A wide sliding door that groaned when pulled open. The kind of building a man would pass without turning his head. But under those rough floorboards, while two horses shifted in their stalls above, and a milk cow chewed hay in the corner, a woman was digging a hole deep into the earth. She was not digging a root cellar. She was not digging a storm pit. She was digging a bedroom. In the spring of 1887, a structural engineer traveled from Chicago to the Callaway homestead outside Dillon Creek, Montana. He had heard the story through a colleague, dismissed it as frontier exaggeration, and then heard it again from a county official who had no reason to embellish. He arrived with a leather satchel, a precision thermometer, and a notebook already half filled with skepticism. He descended the short ladder into the underground chamber. He stood very still. Then he opened his thermometer case and held the instrument at arm's length, turning slowly, measuring the air in each corner of the room. 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the last frost of the season still clung to the north-facing hillsides. He checked his instrument twice. He sat down on the low wooden stool near the stone wall and wrote in his notebook for a long time without speaking. But the knowledge that kept 14 people alive during the worst blizzard in Montana's recorded history had not come from any book. It had not come from an engineer or an architect or any man with credentials. It had come from a tin box that her husband Roy had hidden beneath the cabin floorboard and never lived long enough to give her. That box and what was inside it would not be found until the night the storm arrived. Edna Callaway was 32 years old when her husband died. Roy had gone the way many men went in that country. Slowly, then all at once. A cough that started in November. A fever that came and went through December. By the middle of January 1885, he was gone. He left behind a tidy stack of debts, a homestead that needed more work than one woman could reasonably do, and 2 children who still reached for their father's hand out of habit. Clem was 10, quiet in the way that boys sometimes go quiet when they understand that crying will not change anything. He had Roy's jaw and Roy's steadiness, and none of Roy's patience for sitting still. Within a week of the funeral, he had reorganized the wood stack by size without being asked. Willow was 7. She had spent 3 weeks of the previous winter burning with fever beside the fire, her small chest rising and falling with a wet, dragging sound that kept Edna awake for nights she lost count of. The girl had survived, but the sound of that cough had settled into Edna's memory the way cold settles into stone. Deep, permanent. The cabin was like most cabins in the territory. Rough pine logs stacked and chinked with moss and mud. A single main room with a sleeping loft above. A stone fireplace built more for cooking than warmth. The floorboards were laid directly on packed earth, and in the deep of winter, frost pushed up through the cracks like white fingers reaching. Ice formed on the inside of the window glass. The children slept under every quilt Edna owned, and still their breath hung visible in the dark. She had stuffed rags into the log gaps, packed moss between timbers, hung blankets along the walls. The cold came anyway. Montana wind did not simply blow. It hunted. It found every seam and weak place and pushed through with a kind of patience that felt almost deliberate. After Roy died, Edna went to town. She had $43 in a tobacco tin. Not enough to last through spring, but enough to ask for a room while she sorted out what came next. The boarding house in Dillon Creek was a 2-story frame building run by a woman named Vera Cray, whose husband was the county deputy. Edna had seen the sign in the window before: rooms available, reasonable terms. She stood at the door with Clem on one side and Willa on the other. The girl was still pale from the winter's illness. The boy carried their bag without being asked. Vera Cray opened the door, looked at Edna, looked at the children, and looked back at Edna. "No room," she said, "for a widow with no income and no man." She said it evenly, without cruelty, exactly, but without softness either. The way a person states a policy they did not write and feel no need to question. The door closed. Edna stood on the porch for a moment. The street was not busy, but there were people. A man loading a wagon across the road, a woman stepping out of the dry goods store, a boy sweeping the step of the barber shop. They had all seen. None of them moved. Willa's hand tightened around her mother's fingers. Edna looked down at her daughter, then at her son. Then she turned and walked back toward the wagon without a word. That evening, she sat in the cold cabin and made a decision that she would not put into words for many months. She decided she would never again wait for someone else to offer her safety. Whatever shelter her children needed, she would build it herself. She began watching the barn. It was smaller than the cabin, 20 feet by 16. But she had noticed something during the worst nights of the previous winter, when she went out before dawn to feed the animals and found herself standing longer than necessary in the warmth of their breath. The horses and the cow filled the air with heat from their bodies. The hay stacked deep in the loft trapped that warmth beneath the roof. The north wall was earthed up against the wind. On the nights when the cabin felt like standing inside a block of ice, the barn was survivable without gloves. One evening in late September 1886, she stood in that barn longer than usual, listening to the horses shift in the straw, feeling the cold ease off her shoulders by a few degrees. And she thought about something her father had told her years ago in Pennsylvania, when he was still teaching at the college, and she used to sit at the back of his lectures on earth science and pretend to read while actually listening to every word. He had talked about geothermal stability, about the way soil below 6 feet holds a temperature close to the annual average, regardless of what the air above it does, about how miners in deep shafts work without coats even in January. The earth, he had said, does not panic when the sky turns cold. Edna looked down at the barn floor. She thought about the horses above, the hay, the earthen walls, the distance between the cold that killed and the warmth that waited just beneath her feet. Then she went back to the cabin and told the children. Clem looked at her for a long time. He had Roy's way of thinking things through before he spoke. "Are we going to live underground, Mama?" he finally asked. Edna considered the question seriously, the way he deserved. "No," she said. "We're going to live where the earth keeps its promises." Willa looked at her brother. He gave a small nod. And that was enough. Edna started digging the next morning. She began on a Monday before the children were awake. The barn floor was hard-packed earth beneath the boards, compressed by decades of hooves and weight and frost cycles. She pried up the center planks with a crowbar, stacked them against the far wall, and drove the first shovel into the ground at first light. The blade rang against something solid, skipped sideways, and her arms absorbed the shock all the way to her shoulders. She adjusted her grip, found a softer angle, and drove again. The earth gave. She had planned the dimensions carefully, the way her father had taught her to plan anything that mattered. 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, 7 feet deep. Deep enough that the soil walls would hold steady temperature. Wide enough for 2 pallets, a small table, and room to stand without hunching. She had drawn it 3 times on brown paper before settling on the measurements, checking each calculation twice, the way he used to tap his chalk against the blackboard and say, "Measure what you cannot afford to guess." She dug for 4 hours before Clem appeared in the barn doorway. He looked at the hole. He looked at the pile of earth growing beside it. He looked at his mother, who had removed her coat despite the October chill and whose hair had come loose from its pin on one side. He picked up the second shovel without a word and climbed down beside her. They worked until the light failed. Willa brought water from the cabin pump at midday, standing at the edge of the growing excavation and peering down with wide, serious eyes. "It smells like rain," she said. "That's the earth," Edna told her. "That's what it smells like when it's healthy." Every morning after feeding the animals, Edna lifted boards and climbed down. She hauled dirt out bucket by bucket and spread it across low places in the yard so no one could measure how much earth she had removed. Her hands blistered in the first week. By the second, the blisters had hardened into calluses. Her back ached in a deep, structural way that she ignored because there was no alternative to ignoring it. 3 weeks passed before the chamber took real shape. For the walls, she gathered flat stones from the creek bed half a mile east. Sandstone and limestone, the same formations her father had named for her when she was 9 years old, standing beside a Pennsylvania riverbank while he pointed and explained and expected her to remember. She had remembered. She stacked the stones without mortar, leaning them slightly inward so gravity would do the work of holding them together. Behind the stone, she packed firm earth to keep moisture from seeping through. For the floor, she tamped the soil hard, then sloped it gently toward a corner where she dug a gravel-filled sump to catch any water that found its way in. For the ceiling, she salvaged beams from a collapsed shed at the back of the property. Timber Roy had always meant to clear and never did. She built a frame strong enough to hold the barn floor above, the weight of the animals, the weight of the hay. She tested each joint before trusting it. The entrance was a 3-foot square trap door cut into the barn floor. From inside the barn, it looked like nothing more than boards laid flat. Below, a short ladder led into the chamber. No outside door, no gap for wind to find. Ventilation was the problem she thought about longest. She shaped a clay pipe from drainage tiles she had saved from the summer, 8 inches wide, rising from the chamber ceiling up through the barn wall at a slight angle, disguised as a simple drainage vent on the exterior. Air could move, smoke could escape. But the opening was positioned and angled so that wind could not drive back down through it. The same principle her father had described when explaining mine shaft ventilation in a lecture she had attended at 15, sitting in the back row, drawing pictures in her notebook margins until the technical language caught her attention, and she stopped drawing entirely. In one corner of the chamber, she built a small hearth lined with fire brick she had traded for at the general store, offering 2 days of mending work to the owner's wife in exchange. The hearth was not large. It was not meant to be the primary heat source. It was for cooking, for the occasional fire on the coldest nights, for the comfort of visible flame. The real heat would come from the earth itself. 18 inches of soil surrounded the chamber on every side, soil that held its temperature steady through any winter the sky could produce. The horses and cow above added body warmth that rose through the floorboards. The hay in the loft above them acted as insulation for the whole structure, a deep, dense blanket over everything. On the night she finished the last wall and stood in the completed chamber with an oil lamp, the thermometer Roy had once brought from back east read 55 degrees. Outside, it was 23. She stood there for a long time, holding the lamp, feeling the warmth that did not rush away. Then she climbed up, closed the trap door, and went to tell her children. The word spread the way words always spread in a small town, not through announcement, but through observation and repetition, one mouth to the next, each telling carrying a little more color than the last. Ezra Dunmore was the first to give it a name. Dunmore was a broad-shouldered man who ran the feed store and had opinions about most things and kept them poorly contained. He had ridden past one afternoon and seen Edna carrying stone from her wagon to the barn, her arms loaded, her expression set. "Building something in there, are you?" he called from the road. "Yes," she said, and kept walking. He watched her go inside. He watched her come back out for another load. He told his wife that evening that the Calloway widow was doing something peculiar in her barn, and his wife mentioned it to 2 women at church on Sunday, and by Wednesday the phrase "the mole hole" had been used by at least 4 people in Dillon Creek, and it made Dunmore laugh with the easy confidence of a man who has never had to build anything under difficult circumstances. The young men were less creative, but more consistent. 3 of them, sons of neighboring homesteaders with not enough work to occupy a full day, began riding past the Calloway property with a frequency that had nothing to do with their roots. They took to calling out from the road when they spotted Edna working. "How's the mole hole coming along, Mrs. Calloway? Seen any earthworms down there? Careful you don't come up a different county." She did not respond to any of it. She carried her stone and drove her shovel and fitted her timbers. And after a while the young men got bored and found other amusements, which was what she had calculated would happen. What she had not calculated was the visit from Ezra Dunmore himself on a Thursday morning in late October, when the sky was the color of old tin and the first real cold of the season had arrived overnight. He came with his hat pushed back on his head, in the way of a man who wants to appear casual about something he is not casual about at all. "Just checking on things," he said from the barn doorway, looking past her at the open trap door and the dark square of the chamber below. "Neighborly." "That's kind," she said. "Damp, I'd expect," he said. "Underground like that. Bad for the lungs. Children's lungs especially." "The drainage manages the moisture," she said. "The ventilation manages the air." He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she used her father's language, as if they were waiting to catch the part where she didn't know what she was talking about. "Still," he said, "unusual." "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "It is." He left without saying what he had actually come to say, which she thought might have been a warning of some kind, and which she filed away in the part of her mind where she kept things she could not yet act on. It was 3 days later that the rain came. It arrived on a Tuesday evening as ordinary autumn rain, the kind that drums on roof boards and smells of wet leaves and passes by morning. But it did not pass by morning. It continued through Wednesday, steady and cold, finding every gap in the soil, running in thin sheets across the yard, pooling where the ground had already been disturbed. Edna woke at 2 a.m. on Thursday to a sound she had not heard before. A low, intermittent dripping that did not fit the rhythm of rain on the barn roof. She lit the lamp and lifted the trap door. Water was coming through the east wall. Not a flood. Not yet. But the lower stones had shifted half an inch under the pressure of saturated soil behind them, and a thin channel of muddy water was working its way through the gap, spreading across the tamped floor toward the sump. The sump was handling it, barely, but the wall was moving, and if it moved another inch, the whole eastern face would need to be reset. She stood at the bottom of the ladder in her nightgown and boots and looked at it for a moment. The lamplight showed her the water. It showed her the shifted stones. It showed her the dark stains spreading across the floor she had packed so carefully. She thought about waking Clem. She thought about waiting until morning, when the rain might ease. She thought about the weeks of work behind that wall and the winter ahead of it. She thought about Willa sleeping in the loft above the cabin, pale and small under her quilts. Then she thought about something her father had said about mining operations in the Pennsylvania hills, about how men who worked underground managed groundwater, not by fighting it, but by redirecting it. A channel cut at the base of the wall, filled with coarse gravel, angled toward the sump. "Give the water a path," he had said, "and it will follow the path rather than make its own." She went to get the shovel. She worked until the sky began to gray outside the ventilation pipe. Her knees in the mud, her arms aching from a different kind of effort than digging, a careful, precise effort, cutting a shallow trench along the base of the east wall, packing it with the gravel she had stored in the corner for exactly this kind of adjustment. The water followed the trench. It found the sump. The pressure behind the wall eased. By the time Clem came to feed the horses at dawn, the floor was wet but stable. The wall had stopped moving. Edna was sitting on the bottom rung of the ladder with the lamp between her feet and her head tipped back against the wall, her eyes closed. "Mama," Clem said quietly from above. "I'm awake," she said. The wall held. He came down and looked at the trench. He looked at the gravel. He looked at his mother's mud-covered knees and hands. "I'll reset the stones," he said. "After breakfast," she told him. After breakfast. She had come close to something in those hours. Not to quitting, exactly, but to a version of herself that might have made a different calculation. The kind that weighed humiliation against survival and found humiliation the lesser cost. She had sat in the muddy dark and thought about Ezra Dunmore's house, about whether she could ask to bring the children there, about what she would have to give up of herself to do it. She had thought about it seriously, without flinching, and then she had picked up the shovel because the alternative required her to hand something over that she did not believe she could get back. Her father's voice, patient and precise. "The skills you need are already inside you. You acquired them whether you knew you were doing so or not." She had been listening in those lectures. It turned out that mattered. On a gray morning in early November, Clem came back from town with flour and lamp oil and a thin, half-starved dog at his heels. He was at the dump, Clem said, in a tone that contained the entire argument he expected to have. The dog was perhaps 2 years old, brown and white, medium-sized, with one ear that stood straight and one that folded forward at the tip, as if permanently skeptical. His ribs showed clearly through his coat. He had been left at the dump when his previous owners departed for somewhere else, the way people sometimes left things they no longer wanted to carry. Willa appeared in the barn doorway and went immediately and completely still in the particular way that children do when they want something badly enough that they are afraid movement will disturb the possibility of receiving it. "Please," she said. One word, very quietly. Edna looked at the dog. The dog looked at Edna. He did not wag his tail or perform any kind of appeal. He simply looked at her with dark, steady eyes, the same eyes, she thought, that all abandoned things eventually develop. "He'll eat what we eat," she said. "Nothing extra." "Yes, Mama," Willa said. "He earns his place." "Yes, Mama." The dog, who Clem named Flint within the hour, earned his place before the week was out. He stationed himself at the barn entrance each night and did not sleep deeply, and on the second evening he rose and growled, low and continuous, before any human had heard anything. Edna came to the barn door and looked out and saw Ezra Dunmore's oldest son riding slowly past on the road, watching the property in the way young men watch things they find amusing to observe. Flint's growl had woken her in time to stand in the doorway and be visible, which ended the observation. After that, she was glad of him. He slept beside Willa's pallet every night, pressed against the girl's side, and Willa's sleep, which had been shallow and interrupted since Roy's death, became steady and unbroken. Edna noticed this without comment, because some things are better acknowledged silently. The chamber was finished by mid-November. Edna lowered the children's bedding first. A rope bed with a straw-tick mattress for herself, 2 small pallets for Clem and Willa, a table, 2 oil lamps, a shelf for provisions. She hung a small mirror on the stone wall because her mother had told her once that a mirror in a dark room does something useful to the light and to the spirit, and she had found this to be true. She laid a braided rug over the packed earth floor, a rug she had made herself 2 winters ago from worn-out clothing, and the color of it against the dark floor made the space feel less like a cave and more like a room. When she lit both lamps and the small fire in the hearth and sat in the chair she had carried down plank by plank, the thermometer read 57 degrees. She called the children down. Willa descended the ladder carefully, one rung at a time, with Flint watching from above until Clem lifted him down bodily. The girl stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, looking at the stone walls, the low timber ceiling, the lamps throwing warm shapes across everything. "Mama," she said, "are we poor?" Edna looked around the room, at the rug, at the mirror, at the lamplight moving on the stone, at her son standing with the dog at his feet, and her daughter in the center of the floor, both of them watching her. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are exactly rich enough." Willa considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she sat down on her pallet, pulled Flint close, and began arranging her small collection of objects, a pine cone, a piece of quartz, a button from Roy's coat, on the shelf above her bed. Clem found a flat piece of gray slate near the creek the following week, roughly the size of a book, smooth on one side. He carried it home and set it on the table. "For lessons," he said, and did not look at his mother when he said it, the way children sometimes avoid the face of the person they are trying not to make cry. Edna looked at the slate for a moment. "Good," she said. "We'll start with arithmetic." It was the last week of November when Deputy Wendell Cray came to the homestead. He came in the late morning, when the sky was low and the cold had the particular dry, pressing quality that in that country meant the real winter was no longer arriving, but had arrived. He tied his horse at the fence and came to the barn, where Edna was checking the ventilation pipe for ice blockage, a task she performed every 3 days. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who spend most of their time in the cold. He had a badge on his coat and a folded paper in his hand, and the careful expression of someone who has decided in advance that this conversation will go a certain way. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Deputy Cray," she said. He held out the paper. She took it and unfolded it and read it completely before she said anything else, which she could see irritated him, because he had expected her to be confused by the legal language and hand it back with questions. She was not confused. The document was a formal complaint filed with the county on behalf of the residents of Dillon Creek, citing concerns about the welfare of 2 minor children being housed in conditions beneath acceptable human standards, underground, in a barn, adjacent to livestock. The complaint requested an inspection by the county welfare officer. If the inspection confirmed the described conditions, the court had authority to place the children in alternative care. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it at her side. "Who filed this?" she asked. "It's a community concern," he said. "Whose name is on the document?" He looked at her steadily. "Mine," he said. "As deputy, it's within my authority to file on behalf of public welfare." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze without blinking, the way people do when they have decided their position in advance and don't intend to be moved from it. "My family's land," she said quietly. "The East 40 acres. Roy refused to sell it to you." Something moved through his expression and was gone quickly. Not guilt, exactly. More like acknowledgement. "This is a welfare matter," he said. "Of course," she said. "Bring your inspector, Deputy Cray. Bring him any day you like." She held the paper back out to him. "And bring a thermometer." He took the paper. He looked at her once more, then turned and untied his horse and rode back toward town. Edna watched him go until he reached the first bend in the road and disappeared behind the cottonwoods. Then she went into the barn, climbed down the ladder, sat on the floor beside the cold hearth, and put her face in her hands. She did not weep long. She did not have the time for it, and it would not have helped. And she had already spent her annual portion of that kind of grief when Roy died. But she sat with it for a while, because it deserved to be sat with. The possibility of losing Clem and Willa was not abstract. It was the kind of fear that had a specific physical location, somewhere beneath the sternum, where it lodged and burned. She thought about Pennsylvania, about people she knew there, about whether she could load the children onto a train and put this whole territory behind her, about what she would be leaving. She thought about this honestly, without softening it. Then she felt something warm against her arm. Flint, who had come down the ladder on his own, had pushed his head under her elbow and left it there. She put her hand on his head. She heard the ladder creak and Clem's boots on the rungs, and then he was sitting beside her on the floor without explanation, the way he sometimes did when he understood something was wrong and had decided that presence was what was needed rather than words. After a while, he said quietly, "Papa used to say you were the strongest person he knew." She looked at her son, at the jaw that was Roy's jaw and the eyes that were entirely his own. "Papa was generous," she said. "Papa was accurate," Clem said. She looked at her children's palettes, at the shelf with Willa's pine cone and quartz and button, at the slate board leaning against the table leg, waiting for its first lesson. She was not going anywhere. That same evening, after the children were settled, there was a soft knock at the barn door. Not the front entrance. The side door, the one that faced away from the road. Edna opened it to find Cecily Oakes standing in the dark with a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread and the particular expression of someone who has spent an hour deciding whether to come. Cecily was the school teacher. She had been in Dillon Creek for 3 years, a careful, observant woman who taught 12 children in a single room and kept her opinions close because she had learned what happened to women in small towns who kept their opinions otherwise. She held out the bread without preamble. "I heard about the complaint," she said. "Cray's had his eye on that East 40 since before Roy passed. Everyone knows it, and no one says it." Edna took the bread. "Thank you." "There's a lawyer in Billings," Cecily said. "His name is Theodore Holt. He takes cases he believes in, sometimes without full payment in advance. I can write you a letter of introduction." "I'd be grateful." Cecily looked past Edna into the barn, at the trap door in the floor, at the lamplight coming up through it. "Don't sign anything," she said. "Whatever Cray puts in front of you, don't sign it." "I won't," Edna said. Cecily nodded once, pulled her coat tighter, and walked back into the dark toward the road. Edna stood in the doorway, watching until the sound of footsteps faded. Then she went back inside, climbed down into the chamber, set the bread on the table, and sat in her chair for a long time in the lamplight, thinking about the East 40 acres, about the thermometer on the wall reading 55 degrees, about the tin box she had never found, about Roy's hands, and what they had built and what they had left behind. Outside, the first real wind of winter had begun. It found the barn eaves and pushed against them, testing. The horses shifted in their stalls above. The hay rustled. The temperature in the chamber held steady. The earth did not panic. Neither did she. The last days of November brought a stillness that Edna had learned to distrust. Not the comfortable stillness of an evening after work, when the animals had settled and the lamps were lit and the children were reading by firelight. This was a different quality of quiet. The kind that comes when something large is holding its breath. She noticed it first in Flint. The dog had always been a settled sleeper, pressed against Willa's side through the night, occasionally lifting his head at a sound and then laying it back down when the sound resolved into nothing threatening. But in those final days of November, he stopped settling. He moved from the pallet to the ladder base to the corner near the hearth and back again, circling without rest, his nails making small sounds on the packed earth floor that Edna could hear from her own bed. She watched him do this for 2 nights before she went to the barn above and stood in the darkness, listening. The horses were awake, both of them, standing at the front of their stalls rather than resting at the back the way they did on ordinary nights. The cow had stopped chewing. All 3 animals faced the north wall, which was earthed up against the weather, and all 3 were absolutely still in the particular way that animals go still when they are reading something in the air that human senses cannot reach. Edna stood with them for a long time, She had been raised in a household where observation was considered the beginning of all useful knowledge. Her father had said this so often, in so many contexts, that it had become less a rule than a reflex. She observed. She waited. She went back down to the chamber and looked at the barometer she had built from her father's instructions the previous summer, a sealed glass jar with a narrow neck fitted with a length of thin tubing, the water level in the tube rising and falling with atmospheric pressure changes. She had calibrated it against 3 days of known weather in September and marked the tube with a grease pencil at intervals. The water level was lower than she had ever seen it. Not slightly lower, considerably lower. She stood in the lamplight looking at the tube for a long moment. Then she went to bed, but she did not sleep well, and she was awake before the sky lightened, watching the ceiling above her, which was the floor of the barn above her, which was trembling very slightly in a wind that had not been there when she lay down. In the morning, she made her decision. She would go to town. She told Clem to stay with Willa and keep Flint inside. She told him to fill the water barrels from the pump and bring the extra wood from the yard into the barn. He looked at her face and asked no questions, which she had come to understand was his particular form of trust. She hitched the wagon and drove the 3 miles to Dillon Creek in a sky the color of old pewter, low and featureless, pressing down on the valley like a lid being fitted to a pot. She went first to Birch Halverson, whose farm was the closest to hers. He was a tall, fair-haired man, Norwegian by descent, who had homesteaded the valley 8 years earlier and built a solid cabin with good mortar and deep eaves. He was in his yard splitting wood when she pulled up. She told him what the barometer showed. She told him about the animals. She told him the pressure drop was unlike anything she had measured in her 2 years of observation. He set the axe down and looked at the sky. "Animals don't predict weather with any reliability," he said, not unkindly. "My father kept records in Norway. The correlation is weaker than people believe." "The barometer isn't an animal," she said. He looked at her instrument readings, which she had written on a folded paper. He handed it back. "Could be a standard cold front," he said. "We get them hard in December." "This is November. It happens." She could see he was not dismissing her with contempt, which would have been easier to respond to. He was dismissing her with the particular patience of a man who has decided he understands a situation and is being polite about not saying so directly. "Keep extra wood inside," she said. "That much costs nothing." "I appreciate you coming by," he said, and picked up the axe. She drove to Ezra Dunmore's feed store next. Dunmore listened to her with his arms crossed and his chin raised slightly, which was his listening posture, the one that suggested he was granting an audience rather than receiving information. "The barometer," he said when she finished. "Yes." "You built it yourself." "From documented specifications." He nodded in a way that indicated he had heard what he needed to hear and had already arrived at his conclusion. "Mrs. Calloway, I respect your father's background, truly, but a homemade instrument and some restless horses aren't the foundation for a county-wide weather alert." "I'm not asking for a county-wide alert," she said. "I'm asking you to bring your wood inside and tell your neighbors to check their supplies." "We're fine," he said, "but I appreciate your concern." She drove to 4 more homesteads, at each one a variation of the same conversation, polite attention, reasonable-sounding objections, the specific kindness that people extend to someone they have already decided is mistaken, The last stop was the church. The Reverend was not there, but his wife was. The same woman who had closed the boarding house door in Edna's face 11 months earlier. She came to the church door and looked at Edna on the step with an expression of careful neutrality. "I'd like to speak with the congregation," Edna said. "Even a few minutes at Sunday service, about the weather." "Sunday is 4 days away," the woman said. "Yes. I'll mention your request to my husband." The door closed. Edna sat in the wagon for a moment. The sky had deepened since morning, the gray thickening toward something more deliberate. The wind that had started before dawn was still going, steady and purposeful, from the northwest. She could feel it on the left side of her face, even with her collar up. She drove home. That evening, she filled every barrel and pot and bucket she owned with water from the pump, while the pump still ran freely. She moved all remaining firewood from the yard into the barn and the chamber below. She checked the ventilation pipe, the hearth, the drainage sump. She went over every joint in the timber frame above the chamber with a lamp, looking for weaknesses. She found one cross beam she was not satisfied with and spent 2 hours reinforcing it with a doubled brace she cut from salvaged lumber. Clem worked beside her without being asked and without complaint, handing tools, holding the lamp, carrying boards. When they finished, he sat on the barn floor with Flint beside him and looked at his mother. "How bad?" he asked. She considered giving him a reassuring answer. She decided against it. "I don't know," she said. "Bad enough to be ready." He nodded. "Then we're ready," he said. Cecily Oakes came that same evening, and this time she did not bring bread. She came to the side door, as she had before, but her face was different. It carried the expression of someone who has weighed something carefully and arrived at a conclusion they had hoped to avoid. "I received a letter today," she said, "from the school board. They've heard about my association with your situation. They've made it clear that continued public support for your position could affect my contract renewal in the spring." Edna was quiet. "I have 2 younger sisters in Missouri who depend on what I send them," Cecily said. She did not look away, which took something. "I can't risk the position." "I understand," Edna said. Cecily looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said quietly, and with the precise weight of someone who means it exactly as much as they say it, "I'm sorry." She walked back toward the road. Edna stood in the doorway until the sound of footsteps was gone. Then she went inside and climbed down into the chamber and stood in the lamplight for a long time without moving. She was alone in the way that is different from ordinary solitude. She had had Cecily's quiet support at her back, and now she did not. And the absence of it had a specific shape and weight. She almost told herself it didn't matter. She knew better. She sat in her chair and thought, genuinely, carefully, about whether she was doing the right thing, about whether the pride of building something herself was worth the risk she was running. She thought about what it would mean to go to Pennsylvania, to start somewhere she was known, where the children had people, where she did not have to fight a county deputy over land that was already hers. She was still thinking this when she heard Willa's voice from the pallet. "Mama, I'm here. I dreamed about Papa." A pause. He was fixing the floorboard, the one that always squeaked. Edna looked at her daughter in the lamplight. "Did he fix it?" she asked. "Almost," Willa said. "He said he just needed a little more time." She closed her eyes and listened to Willa's breathing slow back into sleep. She was not going to Pennsylvania. She almost told him then about what she had found the previous evening. She had been in the cabin looking for a particular wrench and had pulled up the loose floorboard near the hearth that Roy had always meant to re-nail and never did, and she had seen the box. It was a tin box, perhaps 8 inches long and 5 inches wide, the kind used for tobacco or small tools. It had been wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a cord and placed in the dry space beneath the board with some care. Roy's handwriting was on the oilcloth in pencil, faded but legible. For Edna, when the time is right. She had held it for a long time without opening it. She did not know why she waited. Some instinct told her the moment was not yet correct. The way certain things need to be opened in the right light, at the right hour, when you are prepared to receive what is inside them. She set the box on the table in the chamber and looked at it that evening while the children slept. And then she covered it with a cloth and went to bed. She would know when. The storm arrived on the 4th day of December. It did not arrive like a single blow. It came the way her father had described the worst weather systems he had witnessed, not as an event, but as a progression, a tightening. On the morning of the 4th, the wind increased from steady to insistent. By midday, it had become something else, a sound with intention in it, pushing against the barn walls with a force that made the timber frame creak at the joints she had reinforced. And at a few, she had not. By evening, the snow came, not soft, not drifting. A wall of white, driven horizontally by wind that had built speed across 300 miles of open plain before it reached the Callaway homestead, and it arrived with everything it had gathered on the way. Visibility dropped to nothing within minutes. The temperature, which had been 12 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, fell to -8 by the time Edna checked the outdoor thermometer she kept nailed to the barn's east wall. She checked it again 2 hours later, -22. She brought the children down into the chamber and closed the trap door and did not open it again that night. The thermometer in the chamber read 54 degrees. She lit both lamps and the hearth and rationed the wood carefully because she did not know how many days this would last, and she had planned for a great deal, but not for everything. The chamber felt small with 3 people and a dog in it, but it was warm and it was dry, and the ventilation pipe moved air steadily through it, even as the wind above tried to tear the world apart. Willa lay on her pallet with Flint against her back and slept through most of the first night. Clem sat at the table with a slate board and worked arithmetic problems by lamplight until his eyes closed and his head tipped forward, and Edna caught the board before it fell and set it gently on the shelf. She did not sleep. She sat in her chair and listened to the storm. She had expected it to be loud, and it was loud, a constant shrieking above and around the barn that peaked and fell and peaked again without ever going quiet. But the chamber itself was remarkably still. She could feel the pressure of the wind in a faint vibration that moved through the stone walls, a humming at a frequency just below sound. The earth was absorbing it, the way the earth absorbs most things eventually, taking the force and distributing it through its mass until the force was no longer force but simply weight, and the weight was simply presence. She thought about her father's lectures, about soil conductivity and thermal mass and the way the ground beneath the frost line exists in a different time than the air above it, responding to seasons months after they have passed, holding summer's warmth through winter's worst, the way memory holds the warmth of people after they are gone. Toward midnight, she took the cloth from the tin box and held it in her lap. for Edna, when the time is right. She understood now that Roy had known something she hadn't. He was not a demonstrative man. He had not been given to dramatic gestures or elaborate explanations, but he had carried this box from somewhere, or received it from someone, and he had hidden it where she would find it when the floorboard she had been asking him to fix for 2 years finally pulled free, which it would eventually, because he had known she would eventually investigate the things he left undone. She untied the cord. She unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was a small notebook, perhaps 60 pages, bound in dark blue cloth covers that had been repaired along the spine with a length of brown thread, the stitches even, and careful. The pages were filled with handwriting she did not recognize, tight, precise letters, slanting slightly to the right, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone who had limited paper and intended to use all of it. She opened to the first page. Agnes Hartwell, her book, written at Bodmin, Cornwall, England. Year of our Lord, 1847. Edna sat very still. Her grandmother, her mother's mother, Agnes Hartwell, who had died in Pennsylvania in 1851, 3 years before Edna was born, whom she knew only from a single daguerreotype that had sat on her father's desk, a small, serious woman with dark eyes and a direct expression, who had come from Cornwall with her husband and 2 small children, and had managed, by all accounts, to make something out of very little in the new country before a fever took her in the spring of Edna's birth year. She turned the pages carefully. The first section was domestic, recipes for bread and preserves. A remedy for chest cold involving ginger and dried thyme, steeped in boiling water and taken with honey before sleep. Instructions for mending wool without leaving a visible seam. The handwriting was the same throughout, unhurried, clear, the record of a woman who wrote things down because she understood that knowledge has a way of disappearing if you don't anchor it to paper. Then the character of the writing changed. Halfway through the notebook, the entries became technical, diagrams drawn with the same precise hand, measurements noted in fractions, detailed instructions for the construction of what Agnes called an earth room, a chamber dug below a structure, lined with stone, ventilated from above, heated by the thermal mass of the surrounding soil. The entry was dated October 1846 and ran for 11 pages. The room must be no less than 6 feet in depth, Agnes had written. At this depth, the soil holds its temperature through any winter this island has produced, and I believe through any winter the new country will produce as well, though I have not yet had occasion to test it there. The walls must be stone, dry laid and backed with packed earth. The floor must drain. The air must move. The heat will come on its own. At the bottom of the page, in slightly different ink, as if written later, I have been told that what I have built is unusual. I have been told by my husband's family that it is unnecessary. They may be correct about the first. They are wrong about the second. This winter, the children did not cough. Edna read the page again and again. She thought about her grandmother's hands, about which she knew nothing, building something in Cornwall that her granddaughter had rebuilt in Montana 40 years later without knowing it had ever been built before. She thought about the chain of it, Agnes to her daughter to Edna's father, who had kept the notebook without knowing what was in it, perhaps, or knowing and choosing to pass it to Roy rather than to Edna directly, which was the kind of thing that happened with important objects in families, the way they traveled sideways and diagonally rather than straight. She thought about Roy. about him carrying this box and hiding it where she would find it, about what he must have read in it and what he must have thought, about whether he had understood, reading Agnes's instructions, that his wife would someday need them. She pressed her hand flat against the open page. The paper was cold and faintly rough under her palm. 60-year-old paper, written by a woman who died before Edna was born, in a country Edna had never seen, in a time before anyone in this valley had been born. "The earth holds," Agnes had written on the last page of the technical section. "I do not know why people find this difficult to believe. It has held since before any of us arrived, and it will hold after we are gone. Trust it." And below that, in the same slightly different ink of the later edition, "If you are reading this, you are my blood. Trust it." Edna sat with the notebook in her lap and listened to the storm above her, which had not diminished. 54 degrees in the chamber, -30, something outside, and dropping. The earth between those two facts, 16 inches of it on every side, steady and absolute. She had built this room without knowing her grandmother had built the same room in another country in another century. She had arrived at the same conclusions through a different path, through her father's lectures, and her own observation and the particular kind of thinking that comes from having no alternatives. But she had arrived, and Agnes had arrived before her. And whoever had taught Agnes had arrived before that. Some knowledge runs underground, she thought. It finds its way through stone and time and loss and resurfaces where it is needed. She was thinking this when she heard the first sound above the storm. Not wind, not the barn structure moving. Something else. A knock. She looked at the trap door. The knock came again. From above, from the barn floor, transmitted through the timber and into the chamber ceiling. Slow, deliberate, the knock of someone who was not certain anyone would answer. She looked at the children, both still sleeping. Flint had lifted his head and was watching the ceiling, his ears forward. She climbed the ladder. She raised the trap door 6 inches and felt the cold pour through the gap. Not the ambient cold of a winter night, but something far beyond that. A cold with mass and velocity, active and consuming. She could not see across the barn. The light from the lamp below lit the near planks and nothing else. She pushed the door fully open and climbed out. The barn was dark and cold, and the wind was finding new ways through gaps she had not thought to seal, and standing just inside the sliding door, which had been pushed open against its latch by the force outside, was Birch Halverson. He was holding his 2 youngest children against his chest, a girl of perhaps 5 and a boy of 7. The girl's face was the color of old ash. The boy was shaking in a continuous, fine shaking way that she recognized as the body's last effort at generating heat. Halverson himself was frost-covered from hat to boot, his beard white with ice, his eyes moving over her face with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the patient dismissal of a man who has already made up his mind. Something else. Something stripped of that entirely. "The roof," he said. His voice came out wrong, thickened by cold. The words inexact. "The north section." It came down. Edna looked at his children. She stepped back from the ladder and opened the trap door wide. "Come down," she said. "Get warm." He looked at the opening in the floor. He looked at her. She could see what it cost him, the geometries of it, The specific arithmetic of a man who has been wrong about something that mattered. "Please," he said, and the word came out small, the way words do when they are carrying more than their usual weight. "Come down," Edna said again. "There's room." He carried the children to the ladder and handed them down one at a time. Willa woke and, without being asked, moved to one side of her pallet and pulled the blanket back, making space. The ash-colored girl lay down. Flint moved immediately to the child's side and pressed against her, his body's warmth against her cold, and the girl made a small sound that was not quite a word, but was closer to language than anything she had produced since arriving. Halverson came down last. He stood in the chamber with his hat in his hands, looking at the thermometer on the wall. 54 degrees. Outside, the wind answered no one. Edna put water on the hearth to heat. The knock came again 40 minutes later. Then again. Then 3 times in the space of an hour, each time a different shape of disaster waiting above the trapdoor. Ezra Dunmore with his father, the old man coughing the deep, wet cough of someone whose lungs had been fighting the cold for hours. Cecily Oakes alone, her coat rimed with ice, her face showing the particular expression of someone who has been wrong about something and knows it and has not yet decided how to carry that knowledge. Each time, Edna climbed the ladder. Each time, she opened the door. Each time she said the same thing, not because she had planned to say it, but because it was the only thing that was true and complete. "Come in. Get warm." She did not say she had told them. She did not say anything about the barometer or the animals or the 3 miles she had driven in the gray November air, going from door to door with information that no one had wanted to receive. She said nothing about any of that because none of it was the point. The point was the cold above and the warmth below, and the fact that warmth, unlike almost everything else of value, does not diminish when you share it. The last knock came near midnight. She had counted 13 people in the chamber. She climbed the ladder for the 14th time and pushed the trap door up and looked out into the dark barn. Deputy Wendell Cray was standing at the far side of the barn floor, near the north wall, where the wind was finding the gap between 2 boards and driving through it in a thin, audible stream. He was not knocking. He had knocked once, she understood, and then stepped back because he could not make himself knock a second time. He was standing with his hat in his hands and his coat covered in snow and his face showing nothing at all, which she recognized as the expression of a man who has exhausted the alternatives and arrived at the one he had been avoiding. He did not speak. She looked at him across the dark barn. The lamplight from the chamber below came up through the open trapdoor and lit the floor between them, and not much else. She thought about the document he had filed, about the East 40 acres, about Vera Cray's face in the boarding house doorway 11 months ago, and her own children standing beside her in the cold, and the specific quality of a door closing in your face when you have nowhere else to go. She thought about all of it. Then she stepped back from the ladder and opened the trap door to its full extent. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He stood where he was for another moment. Then he walked across the barn floor and looked down into the lit chamber below, at the 14 people arranged in the small, warm space that a woman had dug out of the earth with a shovel and a theory, and the words of a grandmother she had never met. He climbed down without speaking. Edna followed him and closed the trap door above them both. The storm did not care who was below the earth and who had put them there. It continued as it had continued, reshaping the valley above into something unrecognizable, burying fences and flattening anything that stood too proud against the wind. It would do this for 2 more days. In the chamber, the thermometer held at 54 degrees. The earth did not panic. It never did. 14 people in a room 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. It should not have worked. The mathematics of it were wrong in several ways that Edna could identify without trying. Not enough pallets. Not enough blankets. Not enough food for 3 days, which was how long she estimated the storm might hold, though she had no certainty about that and did not pretend to. The hearth was sized for 1 family's cooking, not 14 people's warmth. The ventilation pipe was adequate for the air displaced by 3 people and a dog, not for the breathing of a small congregation. And yet, the body heat alone changed everything. 14 people breathing and moving and existing in an enclosed space raised the ambient temperature by nearly 4 degrees within the first hour. She watched the thermometer climb from 54 to 58 and understood that her calculations had been for minimum conditions. These were not minimum conditions. These were the conditions of community, which generate their own warmth through mechanisms that have nothing to do with engineering. She organized what she had. The 2 pallets went to the children, all 5 of them, arranged across both beds in a configuration that left no unused space. Willa moved without being asked to the far edge and pulled the smallest of Halverson's children, the ash-colored girl whose name was Petra, close against her side. Flint arranged himself along the outer edge of the pallet like a living bolster, his body pressed against Petra's back, his head resting on his forepaws, his eyes open and steady. Petra had not spoken since arriving. She had made the small sound when Flint first came to her, and then gone quiet again, her eyes open but focused on something that was not in the room. Edna had seen this before, in Willa during the worst of her winter fever 2 years ago. The way a child's mind retreats to a safer location when the body has been pushed past a certain point. She did not try to bring the girl back with words. She simply made sure Flint stayed close, and the blanket was tucked, and the lamp was positioned so the light fell warm rather than harsh. The adults sat or leaned against the stone walls, arranged by available space rather than by any social logic. Ezra Dunmore's father, whose name was Caleb, sat with his back to the east wall and his legs straight out before him, his breathing audible in a way that concerned Edna. Wet and deep, each breath carrying a sound like paper being slowly torn. She had heard this in Roy during his last weeks, and she knew what it meant, and she knew what it did not mean, which was that she had tools enough to fix it. But she had what she had. She put water on the hearth. From her provision shelf, she took the dried ginger she had stored in a twist of paper and the bunch of dried thyme that hung from a hook near the ventilation pipe, cut in August from the wild plants that grew along the creek south of the barn. She had stored them because her father had mentioned their properties in the context of respiratory conditions during a lecture she had attended at 16, and because Agnes's notebook had listed them in the remedy section for chest cold, and because she had learned to store things whose usefulness she could not immediately predict. She made a tea that smelled of earth and warmth and something faintly medicinal. She put honey in it from the small jar she kept sealed for the children's use. She brought it to Caleb Dunmore in a tin cup and helped him hold it because his hands were shaking with cold and age and the particular exhaustion of a body that has been frightened for too long. He drank it slowly. The sound in his chest did not disappear, but it changed quality, loosening slightly, becoming less the sound of tearing, and more the sound of something working to clear itself. He looked at her over the rim of the cup with pale, watery eyes. "This is Agnes Hartwell's recipe," Edna said quietly, not meaning to say it aloud. "Who?" Caleb asked. "My grandmother," she said. "She wrote it down a long time ago." He nodded as if this made complete sense, which in the way that exhausted old men sometimes understand things clearly. Perhaps it did. Ezra Dunmore sat beside his father and watched Edna work. He had not spoken since climbing down the ladder. This was unusual enough that several people had noticed it. Birch Halverson glancing at him twice with an expression of mild surprise. Dunmore was not a man who found silence natural. He filled rooms with his presence and his opinions as automatically as a fire fills a room with heat. He sat now with his hands on his knees and watched his father's color improve by fractions over the course of an hour, and he said nothing, but his jaw was working in the way jaws work when a man is thinking thoughts he has not yet given permission to become words. Cecily Oakes sat near the ladder base with her knees drawn up and her coat still on. She had stopped shaking within 20 minutes of arriving, which Edna took as a good sign about her core temperature. She watched everything with the particular attention of a woman who records things for a living, a schoolteacher's habit of observation that does not switch off simply because the classroom has changed shape. After an hour, she reached into her coat pocket and produced a small notebook and a pencil stub. She looked at Edna. A question without words. Edna looked at the notebook, then at the room, at the stone walls and the timber ceiling, and the thermometer reading 58 degrees while the storm above tried to unmake the world. She nodded. Cecily opened the notebook and began to write. Deputy Wendell Cray had chosen a position in the far corner of the chamber, the northwest corner where the stone wall met the timber frame at an angle that made the space slightly smaller than anywhere else. He sat with his back in the corner and his knees up and his arms resting on his knees, and he looked at the floor between his boots. He had declined the tea. He had declined the piece of hardtack Edna offered with the same even-handedness she offered everything. He sat in his corner and said nothing to anyone, and no one spoke to him. Edna did not avoid him, and she did not seek him out. She moved through the chamber doing what needed doing, and when her path took her near his corner, she passed without ceremony, the way you pass furniture that has been rearranged and has not yet found its permanent position. She was aware of him. She was aware of everything in the room in the way that a person who has built a thing is always aware of all its components simultaneously. The second night was harder than the first. The storm did not diminish. If anything, it gathered itself in the small hours, the wind rising to a frequency that was less sound than sensation, a pressure against the eardrums, a vibration in the chest. The temperature outside, which she could not measure directly but could estimate from the rate of ice formation on the ventilation pipe's exterior fitting, had fallen to somewhere below -35. She had calculated that the ambient body heat in the chamber plus the small hearth fire she kept banked low through the night would maintain the interior temperature above 50 degrees. The thermometer confirmed this. 52 at its lowest point at 3 in the morning when the fire had burned down and the human bodies had gone into the deep stillness of sleep and were generating less heat. She fed the fire. She checked the thermometer. She checked the ventilation pipe for blockage, inserting a long, thin rod she kept for this purpose and feeling for resistance. Clear. She checked the drainage sump, which was handling a small seep from the east wall with the same quiet competence it had demonstrated since she'd installed the gravel channel. She checked the faces of the sleeping children, one by one, the way she had checked Willa's face through the fever nights 2 years ago, reading color and breathing, and the particular quality of stillness that means rest rather than crisis. Petra Halverson's color had returned. Not fully, but enough. The ash had become something closer to pale, and pale was survivable. The girl was breathing through her nose, which she had not been doing on arrival. Flint had not moved from beside her. His eyes were open and met Edna's when she crouched to look, and she put her hand briefly on his head, and he leaned into it with the small, concentrated pressure that was his version of communication. "Good dog," she said very quietly. His tail moved once, low and slow. She was straightening up when Petra spoke. The voice was small and rough from cold and disuse, but it was distinct. "Can I keep petting the dog?" The question went through the room like a current. 3 people who had been sleeping were suddenly not sleeping. Birch Halverson, who had been motionless against the wall for 2 hours, opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. Cecily Oakes, who had been sitting with her eyes closed, opened them and looked at the child, and then very deliberately looked at the wall instead, which is what people do when they need a moment before their face will cooperate. Halverson made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he thought might be lost turns out not to be. A sound that has no letter equivalent and does not need one. Edna looked at Willa, who was watching Petra with a calm, satisfied expression. The expression of someone who has understood exactly what needed to happen and has made it happen and is not surprised by the result. "You can always pet him," Willa told Petra gravely. "Flint doesn't mind." Petra's hand moved under the blanket and found the dog's side. Flint sighed, a long, settling sigh, the kind that communicates absolute contentment, and someone in the room, Edna could not see who, made a sound that was half laugh and half something else, and the chamber, which had been held in a kind of suspended collective breath for 2 days, released something it had been holding. Ezra Dunmore spoke for the first time. He did not address anyone in particular. He spoke toward the floor between his feet, in the way of a man who is not accustomed to the kind of thing he is saying and is not certain of the protocol. "I was wrong," he said, "about the—" He stopped, started again. "About all of it. The barometer. The animals." A pause. "The name I gave this place." No one responded immediately. The fire settled in the hearth. The ventilation pipe carried a faint note of wind from above, like a distant instrument playing a single sustained note. "I was wrong about everything, Mrs. Calloway." He looked up then, directly at her, his broad face showing something she had not seen on it before. Not the comfortable confidence of a man with opinions, something stripped of that. Something that had sat with his father's breathing through the night and arrived at a conclusion it could not avoid. Everything. "You're here," Edna said. "That's what matters now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his father, who had fallen back asleep with the tin cup still loosely in his hand, his breathing audible but no longer alarming. And Dunmore looked at his father the way a man looks at something he almost lost, which is differently than he has ever looked at it before. Birch Halverson, from his position against the far wall, caught Edna's eye. He gave a small nod. Not the dismissive nod of a man granting an audience. Something else. The nod of a man acknowledging a debt that words are not large enough to cover. She nodded back. Cecily was writing in her notebook. Edna saw this and felt something she could not immediately name. Not pleasure, exactly. Something more like recognition. The knowledge that Agnes had written things down because she understood that knowledge disappears if you don't anchor it. And now Cecily was writing things down for the same reason, in a different century, in a different country, in a room that would not exist if Agnes had not written and Edna had not read. She thought about chains, about how they look from outside, link by link, clear and logical, and how they look from inside, where you cannot see the links ahead and can only barely see the links behind, and you simply keep moving because movement is the only thing that makes the chain. She went to the corner where Cray sat. She did not bring tea. She did not bring anything. She crouched down to his level and looked at him, which required him to look back at her or make a conscious choice to avoid it. He chose to look back. His face in the lamplight was older than she had thought him. The cold had taken something from it, some of the official composure that the badge and the authority usually provided. What remained was a man about her own age who had made calculations that had seemed reasonable at the time and was now sitting in the proof of their unreasonableness. She did not make him speak. She simply looked at him with the same directness she had used in the barn doorway 11 months ago, when Vera Cray had closed the door, and in the yard when he had handed her the county document, and on the road when she had told him to bring a thermometer. After a moment, he reached inside his coat. He produced a folded paper. She recognized it, the document, the complaint, the legal language about unacceptable conditions, and the welfare of minor children. He held it out to her. She took it. It had been torn in half, cleanly, along the vertical center. Both halves were there. She looked at them for a moment, at her name in the legal language and the children's names and the county seal on the upper portion. The East 40, she said quietly. Roy's land. Yours, he said. His voice was flat. It was always yours. She folded the two halves together and set them on the table beside Agnes's notebook. She would decide what to do with them in the morning. Tonight, there were other things. She went back to the hearth and put more water on and found the last of her dried ginger and the remainder of the thyme and made more tea, enough for anyone who wanted it. She portioned out the remaining food carefully, calculating what they had against how many days they might need it, and found that if she was careful and everyone ate less than they wanted, which was a condition all of them were already accepting, they would manage. She sat in her chair in the small hours of the third morning and looked at the room. Halverson's children sleeping, her own children sleeping, Dunmore's father sleeping, his breathing easier, Cicely asleep with her notebook against her chest, Halverson himself asleep sitting up, his head fallen to one side, his face relaxed into something younger than his usual expression. Other neighbors she had known only as passing acquaintances, now sleeping in her home, in the room she had dug with her own hands in October, with blistered palms, and an aching back, and a calculation that the earth would hold. The earth had held. She looked at the thermometer. 53 degrees. The fire needed feeding. She got up and fed it, carefully, one piece at a time, the way you tend anything that matters. She was setting the second piece on the fire when she heard Cray move in his corner. She did not look up immediately. She finished with the fire and replaced the iron screen, and then looked across the chamber. He was asleep. Finally. His head tipped back against the stone, his face in the lamplight showing the particular stillness of deep sleep, the kind that comes after the body has held tension for too long and simply gives out. His hands were open on his knees, palm up, the posture of surrender that the body takes when the mind has finally stopped arguing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to her chair and sat down and picked up Agnes's notebook and opened it to the last page, to the words written in slightly different ink, added later, in the hand of a woman who had wanted to make sure. The message survived the distance it needed to travel. If you are reading this, you are my blood. The earth holds. Trust it. Outside, the storm continued. It was losing something, she thought. Not its force exactly, but its certainty. The note of it had changed in the small hours, the shrieking becoming something lower and more exhausted. She had been listening to it long enough now to hear the difference. She thought it would break by morning. She thought, 14 people. She thought about her father's voice, patient and precise, in a lecture hall in Pennsylvania, pointing at a diagram of soil strata and saying that the earth below the frost line exists in a different relationship to time than the air above it. She thought about Agnes in Cornwall in 1847, writing in a notebook by whatever light she had, stitching the spine with brown thread when the binding came loose, making the record as permanent as she could make it. She thought about Roy, hiding the box beneath the floorboard he never fixed, in the particular faith of a man who trusts that the right moment will arrive even if he is not there to see it. She put her hand flat on the page. The paper was cold and faintly rough, 60-year-old paper, written by a woman who died before Edna was born. She could feel the grain of it against her palm, the specific texture of something that has lasted. She closed her eyes and listened to the storm diminishing, and to 14 people breathing in the warmth of the room she had built, and to Flint shifting in his sleep beside Willa and Petra, and to the fire settling in the small hearth, and to all of it together, which sounded, if you listened the right way, like something that had always been meant to be exactly this. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th of December, not gently. It did not ease away or soften into ordinary winter weather. It simply stopped the way a held breath stops, all at once, the wind dropping from its sustained shriek to nothing in the space of perhaps 20 minutes, leaving behind a silence so complete that several people woke from sleep because the absence of sound was louder than the sound had been. Edna was already awake. She had heard the change coming in the last hour before dawn, the way the note of the wind had descended through registers, losing its upper frequencies first, the shrieking becoming howling, becoming a low moan, becoming silence. She had sat in her chair and listened to it go and had not moved until it was fully gone, because she had learned in the past 3 days not to trust partial quiet. When she was certain, she climbed the ladder. She pushed the trap door up and the cold came through, but it was a different cold than before. Still, dry. The cold of aftermath rather than the cold of assault. She climbed out into the barn and stood for a moment, listening. The horses were calm. The cow had resumed chewing. Pale light was coming through the gaps in the barn siding, the specific pale blue light of a world covered in new snow with the sun just beginning to find it. She pulled the sliding door open 6 inches and looked out. The valley had been remade. Every fence line had disappeared. The road was gone. The cottonwoods along the creek were bent permanently to the southeast, their upper branches encased in ice that caught the early light and fractured it. 3 of the homesteads visible from the barn door had lost portions of their roof lines. One structure at the far eastern edge of the valley, the small cabin that had belonged to a man named Hector Vane, who had ranched alone on 40 acres since before Edna arrived in the territory, had its north wall down entirely. She stood looking at that collapsed wall for a long moment. Hector Vane was 73 years old. He had lived alone since his wife died in 1879. He had been among the first people she had tried to warn when the barometer reading first concerned her, weeks before the storm. He had listened at his door with his arms crossed and the patience of a man who has survived many winters, and attributed this survival to his own judgment. She had not gone back to him. She stood at the barn door in the early morning light and looked at the collapsed wall of his cabin and felt the specific weight of a thing you cannot change. Not guilt, exactly. She had gone. She had warned as she had warned everyone. He had made his choice, as everyone makes their choices. And sometimes the choices we make in confidence are the ones that cost us everything. But the weight was there regardless, the way weight always is when a life ends and you find yourself calculating the distance between what happened and what might have happened instead. She went back down and told the room, quietly, what she had seen. The silence that followed was different from the silence of sleep. It was the silence of people absorbing information about the permanent kind of loss. Birch Halverson was the one who spoke first. "We should go," he said, not to any particular person, to the room. "We should go now and see what needs doing." There was a general, wordless agreement. People began moving, straightening clothing, pulling on coats that had dried overnight against the warm stone walls. The children were slower to rise, disoriented by the sudden activity after days of enforced stillness. Willa sat up on her pallet with her hair loose and Flint beside her and looked at her mother with a question she didn't ask aloud. "It's over," Edna told her. "The storm is over." Willa looked at Petra Halverson, who was sitting up on the other side of the pallet, her color almost fully returned, her eyes clear. The 2 girls looked at each other with the particular understanding of children who have shared a bed through something difficult, which creates a bond that takes adults much longer to form. "You can come see the barn," Willa told her. "We have a milk cow." Petra considered this seriously. "Does she bite?" "Only sometimes," Willa said, "but not hard." Edna turned away before her face could do something she didn't intend. They climbed out of the chamber one by one, 14 people emerging into the cold barn, gathering themselves, pulling on hats and gloves. The barn smelled of animal warmth and hay, and 3 days of shared human occupation. The horses regarded the crowd without alarm. Edna pulled the sliding door fully open. The light came in hard and white, and everyone stood blinking in it for a moment, the way people blink when they come out of somewhere dark into the full world. Then Halverson stepped out first and sank to his thigh in snow, and someone exhaled a long breath, and then they were all moving, wading out into the transformed valley, each person heading toward what they had left. Edna watched them go. Ezra Dunmore was the last to leave the barn, behind his father whom he was supporting with a hand under one arm. Caleb Dunmore's breathing had improved further overnight, the remedy and the warmth having done what they could do, though he would need proper rest and continued treatment, and she suspected he would need to see a doctor in Billings before the winter was fully through. At the barn door, Ezra stopped. He turned and looked at her, not with the expression he usually wore, the broad, assured expression of a man who runs a feed store and has opinions and expects them to carry weight. Something else, something that had been sitting with a night's worth of watching his father breathe and had arrived somewhere new. "The name," he said. "The mole hole." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'll see that it stops." "People can call it what they like," Edna said. "No," he said. "They can't. Not anymore." He looked at the trap door in the barn floor, still standing open, the lamplight from below making a warm square in the cold morning. "What would you call it?" She thought about it. "The Earth Room," she said. "That's what my grandmother called it." He nodded slowly. "The Earth Room," he repeated, as if fixing it. Then he helped his father through the barn door and out into the snow. Edna stood alone in the barn for a moment. Flint sat beside her, pressed against her leg, watching the open door where the last of them had gone. The horses moved in their stalls. The cow chewed. The lamp below sent its light up through the open trapdoor, steady and even. She went to find Hector Vane. She took the snowshoes from the barn wall and went alone. Not because she wanted to be alone, but because Clem was keeping Willa and the other children occupied, and because this was the kind of errand that does not improve with company. She followed what had been the road by the line of buried fence posts and reached the collapsed cabin in 20 minutes. The north wall had fallen inward. The roof had followed it. The interior was filled with snow and broken timber. She called his name twice and heard nothing. And then she went around to the south side where the door had been and found it, miraculously, still standing in its frame, the one wall that had held. She opened the door. Hector Vane was sitting in his chair by the dead fireplace. His coat was on, and his hat was on, and his hands were folded in his lap, in the posture of a man who had decided he was staying where he was. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and the temperature in the standing portion of the cabin, with its roof intact and its south and east walls holding, had been cold, but not the cold of outside, not the cold that kills in minutes. It had been the cold of a room without heat, which is a different thing. He was not dead. He was very cold, and very still, and very old. But he opened his eyes when she touched his shoulder, and they were clear. She did not say anything about the warning she had given. She did not say anything about the barometer or the animals or the miles she had driven. She said, "Let's get you warm," and she meant it without condition, which was the only way she knew how to mean things. She helped him to the Callaway homestead on the snowshoes, a slow and difficult process that took the better part of an hour, and she put him in the chair in the earth room with a blanket and the last of the ginger tea, and left Willa to sit with him because Willa had a quality of stillness that was useful to people who had been frightened. Clem went with her back out into the valley. They moved from homestead to homestead through the morning, doing what could be done with what was available. At the Halverson place, the roof section that had come down was the north lean-to, not the main cabin, and Halverson and his older son had already begun clearing debris by the time Edna arrived. At the Dunmore property, the cabin had held, but the barn roof had sagged and would need shoring before the next snowfall. She showed Ezra's son how to cut and position a temporary support, using the same principle she had used in the earth room ceiling. A doubled brace at the weak point, taking the weight over a wider area. She did not think of it as teaching. She thought of it as showing someone something she knew that they needed, which was the same thing her father had done in his lectures, which was the same thing Agnes had done in her notebook. At midday, the community gathered without planning to gather, the way communities do after emergencies, everyone ending up in the same place through the gravity of shared experience. They gathered at the Callaway barn, perhaps because it was the largest structure that had come through undamaged, perhaps because it was where most of them had spent the past 3 days, and the space had acquired a familiar weight. Birch Halverson stood in the center of the barn with snow still on his coat and spoke in a voice that carried to the walls. 14 people, he said. 14 people in this valley are alive and standing here because of what Edna Callaway built under this floor. He looked around the gathered faces, his neighbors, people he had known for years, people who had called the earth room peculiar and the mole hole, and various other things that now sat differently in everyone's mouths. I rode past this barn every week for 2 months. I heard what people were saying. I said some of it myself. He stopped. I was wrong. I want to say that in front of everyone. No one spoke immediately. Then Cecily Oakes, who was standing near the barn wall with her notebook in her hands and her pencil behind her ear, said, "It should be on record. Officially. What she built, what it did, how it works. I've been writing it down. If Mrs. Callaway will let me, I'd like to finish the account and have it filed with the county." Edna looked at her. Cecily had come back. She had left, and she had come back, which was not nothing. It was not everything either, but it was not nothing. "Yes," Edna said. "I have my grandmother's notebook. You can work from that." Deputy Wendell Cray was standing at the back of the gathered group, slightly apart, in the specific position of a man who is present but not certain of his welcome. He had not spoken since handing her the torn document in the earth room. He had helped, through the morning, doing the physical work that needed doing, clearing debris, carrying supplies, the kind of work that allows a person to occupy space without requiring them to be understood yet. He was good at it. She had watched him work and thought that he was a man who knew how to use his hands, which suggested his life might have gone differently if different choices had been available to him at the decisive moments. She did not know if that was true. She would probably never know enough of his story to know if it was true. But she thought it, which was more generosity than she had extended to him before. After the gathering, after people had begun drifting back to their own properties to assess and repair and make plans, Cray approached her in the barnyard. He stood at a distance that was respectful without being evasive and looked at her directly. "The East 40, he said. "I'll file the correction with the county office when the road's open. Your husband's deed, with your name added as surviving owner. It should have been done when he died. I should have seen to it." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He accepted this without defense. "My wife," he started, then stopped. He looked at the sky, which was the hard, brilliant blue of post-storm winter, clear and cold and indifferent. "Vera has gone to stay with her sister in Billings. I don't know if she's coming back." He said this with the flatness of someone reporting a fact they have not yet fully understood. "I suspect she is not." Edna did not know what to say to this, so she said nothing, which was the right choice. He put his hat on and looked at the barn and then at her. "If you need anything," he said, "from the county, from the office, send Clem." He paused. "I'll see to it." He walked back toward the road where his horse was tied. and she watched him go, not with satisfaction and not with warmth, but with the particular neutrality of a person who has closed a chapter and is standing at the top of the next page, looking at blank space. He had done what he could do. Some things could not be undone, and she did not expect them to be, and the East 40 was hers, which was what had always been true. And truth had simply required a blizzard and a torn document and 3 days underground to reassert itself. Vera Cray did not return from Billings. Word reached Dillon Creek the following spring that she and her husband had relocated entirely to somewhere in Oregon, a place none of the valley's residents had any reason to visit. Their departure was noted and then not discussed, in the way of departures that everyone understands and no one needs to explain. Edna watched the road on the morning she heard the news. Clem stood beside her. "Are you glad they're gone, Mama?" he asked. "I'm glad we stayed," she said. Birch Halverson found her in the afternoon, when the light was already going gold and low in the way of December, and he came with his older son, and they carried lumber. "For the lean-to repair," he said. "I thought we'd start today, while there's light." She looked at the lumber, at Halverson's face, which was open in a way she had not seen it before. "I could use help with the barn's north seam," she said. "Wind found a gap. I haven't had time." "Show me," he said. They worked until the light failed, the three of them, Halverson and his son and Clem, who appeared without being summoned and worked beside the older men with the quiet competence he had developed over 2 months of building alongside his mother. Edna directed and occasionally worked herself, fitting boards and sealing gaps with a material she had mixed from clay and dry grass, a technique from Agnes's notebook that she had been meaning to test and found effective. When the light was gone, Halverson's son went home, and Halverson lingered. He was not a man who worked carelessly with his hands, but words cost him more than timber, and important words cost him most of all. "My daughter," he said. "Petra." He stopped. He looked at the far wall of the barn. She wasn't speaking before. After the cold, she wouldn't speak. "I noticed," Edna said. "And then your girl. And the dog." Willa understood what Petra needed, Edna said. "I didn't teach her that. She knew." He looked up. His eyes in the lamplight were very blue, pale Scandinavian blue, and they were doing something complicated. "I should have listened to you," he said, "in November, when you came to the door." "You're here," she said. "Your children are alive. That's what matters." "It's not all that matters," he said quietly, "but I don't have the right language for the rest of it yet." He put his coat back on. "I'll come back tomorrow, if there's more to do." "There's always more to do," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, the beginning of something, the way a cleared field is the beginning of something. He went out through the barn door into the cold evening, and she stood in the lamplight listening to his footsteps in the snow until they faded. Clem appeared at her elbow. He had Roy's gift for appearing without sound when something was being observed. "He comes by a lot," Clem said in the careful tone of a boy who has an opinion and is deciding how directly to state it. "He's a neighbor," Edna said. "He looks at you," Clem said, "the way Papa used to." She did not answer this immediately. She picked up the lamp and checked the ventilation pipe and inspected the trapdoor's hinges, all of which she had checked that morning and did not need to check again. "Papa was your father," she said finally. "He's not replaceable." "I know," Clem said. "I didn't mean replaced." He considered. I meant there's room in a house for more than one kind of warmth. She looked at her son, this boy with Roy's jaw and Roy's steadiness, and something that was entirely his own. Something that was perhaps not Roy's at all, but hers, or Agnes's, or some combination of everyone who had handed knowledge down a chain long enough to reach this barn in Montana in December of 1886. "Go check on Hector Vane," she said. "Make sure he's eaten." He went the way he went to everything, without complaint and without requiring the last word. In the summer of 1887, Cecily Oakes completed her account and filed it with the Territorial Records Office in Helena and with the county clerk in Billings. It described the construction of the earth room in technical detail, drawing on Agnes's notebook and Edna's own explanation, and it described the storm and the 14 people and what the thermometer had read while the valley shivered above. The account was dry and factual in the way of documents meant to last, which is to say, it was exactly right. That same summer, 5 families in the Dillon Creek Valley began digging earth rooms beneath their barns. Edna went to each one and answered questions. She showed people where to place the gravel sump and how to angle the ventilation pipe and how to seat the stones without mortar so that gravity did the holding. She did not charge for this. She thought of it the way she thought of most things she had learned from her father and from Agnes, as information that had been given to her and was therefore not fully hers to keep. Birch Halverson dug the first earth room of the 5. He asked for her opinion on the placement of the hearth and accepted it without qualification. He came by the Callaway homestead most weeks through that summer, with lumber or with tools, or sometimes with no particular reason that he stated. And Clem watched this with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose analysis has been confirmed. And Willa watched it with the uncomplicated approval of a child who understands warmth in all its forms. Edna did not hurry anything. There had been enough hurrying in the past 2 years, enough forced decisions and impossible calculations and choices made in the dark with cold hands. She was 32 years old, and the East 40 acres were hers, and the earth room was sound, and Agnes's notebook was on the table in the lamplight, and there was time. Flint lived 11 years, which is a good age for a dog who spent his first 2 at a dump. He slept beside Willa until she left for her own home, and then he slept beside the trap door of the earth room, as if keeping watch over what was below. He went quietly. On a November morning, lying in a patch of sun on the barn floor, Clem built a small marker from cedar and set it at the earth room entrance. He carved 4 words into it. Flint, he knew first. The marker stood there through every winter after, weathering slowly, the letters going soft at the edges the way all things do when they have lasted long enough to matter. Years passed, as years do, without asking permission. Clem Callaway grew into the kind of man his mother had shaped him to be, quiet and precise and capable in the way of people who learned their first lessons in difficult circumstances. He studied engineering in Billings and then in Denver and came back to Montana because Montana was where he understood the ground. He built structures across the territory that incorporated the principles his mother had applied in the Callaway barn, foundations that worked with the earth rather than against it, chambers that used thermal mass rather than fighting cold with fire alone. When people asked where he had learned, he said his mother. When they asked where she had learned, he said her grandmother. When they asked where the grandmother had learned, he said he didn't know, but that she had written it down, which was the important thing. Willa Callaway became a teacher. as Cecily Oakes had been a teacher, as teachers sometimes make teachers, passing the habit of observation and record forward. She taught in Dillon Creek for 30 years. On the wall of her classroom, she kept a framed copy of her great-grandmother's instructions, transcribed in her own careful hand, with a note at the bottom in smaller letters. Agnes Hartwell, Cornwall, England, 1847. The earth holds. Trust it. When students asked about it, she told them the whole story. The barn, the storm, the 14 people, the tin box beneath the floorboard. She told it the way good teachers tell important things, without simplification, with all the difficulty left in, because the difficulty is where the lesson lives. The earth room beneath the Callaway barn was used for 43 winters. When Edna was old and her grandchildren had come to fill the homestead with noise and movement, she sat sometimes on the bench outside the barn door in the late afternoon, when the light came low and gold across the valley, and she felt the ground beneath her feet, which was not frozen even in January, at this depth, at this place, because the earth below the frost line exists in a different relationship to time. A granddaughter asked her once, sitting beside her on the bench in the autumn of a year late enough that the valley looked almost unrecognizable from what it had been, "Grandma, were you really scared?" Edna looked at the valley, at the cottonwoods along the creek, grown tall now, their ice-bent years long behind them. At the barn, sound and weathered, with its trap door that still opened on a room where the thermometer still read 54 degrees. "I was terrified," she said. "Every morning I woke up and chose to stay anyway." The granddaughter was quiet for a moment. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "What you know? What great-great-grandmother Agnes wrote?" Edna looked at her hands. They were old hands now, the knuckles enlarged, the skin thin, but the palms still showed the architecture of work, the particular topography of a life spent building things that lasted. "I will teach you everything," she said. In 1952, a researcher from the Montana Historical Society came to the Callaway homestead, which had been in the family for 3 generations by then, to measure and document the earth room that had been the subject of a county record filed in 1887. She descended the ladder. She held her thermometer at arm's length in each corner of the room. 54 degrees, 65 years after the storm. The stone walls intact, the timber frame sound, the gravel sump still doing its quiet work in the corner. She stayed for 2 hours, measuring and noting and photographing. When she climbed out, she stood in the barn for a moment, looking at the trap door, thinking about what it meant that something built by a woman alone in October 1886 was still standing, still functioning, still exactly what it had been built to be. She filed her report with the historical office and recommended the site for preservation. The small plaque mounted to the barn's exterior the following spring read, "Edna Callaway, 1854 to 1931. She listened to the earth. And if you are facing your own storm right now, whatever form it takes, whatever the temperature outside your window, whatever the weight pressing down from above, remember her. She was terrified. She kept digging. The earth holds. And so will you."